Здравейте, драги зрители! Did you miss me? Don't worry, I am still alive. Changing jobs during tough times can be a bit of a pickle, but that is besides the point, as you're here for entertainment and not for me to be depressing. You may have heard it said that sometimes the original isn't always the best. In this rat's subjective view, that statement is correct, as I have a small confession to make. Despite the opulent evidence to the contrary in this channel, Warhammer 40K is not my most favorite sci-fi setting. Star Wars was my first crush. 40K is the popular girl that grabbed my fancy, but my one true love forever remains StarCraft. And I introduced the aforementioned statement because, from what I've learned, StarCraft was originally supposed to be a 40K game. But GW decided not to pursue the project further, leading to Blizzard, the good Blizzard, before the corruption, to remake it into the best RTS franchise to this day. Why am I bringing this all up at all? Well, I've been reviving that flame in the last few months and got the craving to gush about it. Plus, I love the crossover comparison videos between verses, of which there are woefully few when it comes to putting these two against one another, despite this supposed connection between them. Set closeness, in essence, is also part of the reasons why, if any of the StarCraft factions was put into the 40K galaxy, not only would they survive, but in some aspects, maybe even thrive. And, as per tradition, when it comes to such clashes between science fictions in the deep cosmos, we'll begin with the humans. In advance of the actual meat of the video, I'd like to extend heartfelt thanks to the lore master of StarCraft, Subsaurian, for helping me with the research process. Now, for this we'll only be talking about the Terrans from the Caprulu sector, the chunk of the galaxy where the StarCraft story takes place, because there isn't really any lore for the rest of the human race in the galaxy. In that regard, while Blizzard have never really given any concrete numbers on the total population, based on the various types of inhabited planets seen throughout the story, the best estimate that we have is that roughly about 50 billion Terrans are kicking around in this frontier of space. Said population being split between three different nations: the Terran Dominion, largest and most stable empire; the Kelmorian Combine, second most populated under the governorship of two megacorps, one a mining guild and the other a shipping one, along with their associates who usurped the original government, more famous for utilizing irregulars like pirates and mercenaries in addition to their standing forces; and the Umosian Protectorate, smallest of the three, but mainly because they decided to build tall instead of wide, so their technology is also the most advanced, enabling them to maintain their rather isolationist existence without too much interference from the previous two. I can already see some of the Warhammerites going to the comments to inform the rest of us that...
Ooh, that's kind of small. Yikes.
And while that may be the case, it is no less an impressive feat. We're talking 4 prison/colony ships shot into the void, one of which was destroyed, crashing on 3 separate planets, and in the span of less than 300 years bloomed into such numbers, establishing multiple star-spanning empires, survived huge incursions from terrifying Xenos and the larger empire of humanity, and ended up helping kill basically an old one/a chaos god.
Hello, Duran. Do you remember what you did to me?
Stukov, you have come to gloat, haven't you?
No. I've come to say good night, you son of a bitch.
No 40K faction can boast to have done so in such a short span of time. And how did these mere Terrans achieve all that, while being stuck in an outback of space where most of the planets are as far from paradise as you can get? Well, to quote James Raynor,
2 things: ingenuity and a never-say-die spirit. Terrans are no strangers to hardship. May not have the advanced technology of the protoss, or the adaptability of the zerg, but the fact that we'll fight together as a team, right down to the last man or woman, well, that makes us a force to be reckoned with.
a sentiment worthy to be proud of, especially when it is backed up by action. This is where we'll dispose of a few of the greatest misconceptions about the Terrans that get referenced by most others. For starters, that all of their basic standing forces, the Marines, are drugged up convicts. Yeah, no. Not anymore at least. The Confederacy, the original biggest nation that formed in their neck of the woods, which is basically Space Australia, had the majority of its military be conscripted convicts, and if extra manpower was needed, civilians, who were put through resocialization. We'll put a pin in this one and get back to it in a bit. But after it was overthrown and overtaken by the Terran Dominion, their professional soldiery got a large increase in volunteering recruits. By the current timeline, across all of the Terran nations, on average there is a near equal split between recruits and conscripts in their militaries. Among which are also a great deal of ranks and divisions that are regular foot soldiers who only get suitable weapons without the defense of the mechanical suits, or are straight-up penal formations, just like the Imperial Guard. Which brings us to the other really common misconception: Terran Marines getting conflated with Space Marines. Granted, this one is easy to make, given how similar their names and looks are, but it is a vast difference. Where the Astaris are augmented superhumans, Marines are just regular baseline humans with access to some combat stimulants. So in reality, it's more accurate to identify the Terran forces as guard regiments with access to power armor. A second pin we'll peek at later. Yet, despite that, I'd argue that these average soldiers are made of sterner stuff and perform better in the face of danger than nearly all, save maybe the really zealously devoted, of the Imperial Guard regiments across the Imperium. On one hand, because resocialization keeps around half of them in line all the time, and on the other, the normal recruits possess a level of courage and dedication that stood in the face of cosmic horror and came out on top. Without a God Emperor, without any kind of officially enforced faith or ideology that assures the safety of their souls, scores of men and women bravely held ground, fought back, and even marched into the mouth of hell. Figuratively, when it comes to the Zerg homeworld of Char, or the myriad of other planets in the sector that are as far from paradise as you can get, and literally, when they invaded the StarCraft universe's equivalent of the Warp, with the goal of killing what was essentially a Chaos God, all out of duty, conviction, and the desire to protect their way of life and the human species as a whole. Okay, and very likely some less savory motivations as well.
It is strange that this Kelmorian Combine continues to operate while the UEG grips the Dominion with an iron fist. I'll never underestimate the motivational effects of Terran greed again.
But the point stands. They risked going against evil, godly space magic, with no guarantee of victory, and more importantly, with no certitude or knowledge whether their own souls would be spared whatever these forms of hell could do to them. That is some heavy-grade mental fortitude right there, which would be a more than sufficient match for the terrors of the 41st millennium. Now, while having a will strong enough to not break in the face of the things Warhammer can throw at them is great, and clears them the line of being able to viably contend in such a galaxy, it wouldn't really mean much if they lacked the practical tools necessary to actually fight on. Luckily for them, the Terrans have developed a great many toys that make some noise. Founded on the bedrock shoulders of the CMC-powered combat suit. Here's where we make our first unpin. Technically, what the Terrans are wearing is not power armor, like that of the Astartes. It does not enhance the physical abilities of the wearer, instead just allowing them to pilot the strength and speed it is normally capable of, making it a closer analog to a miniature mech suit, more or less designed to allow them to bear and wield the properly killy weapons that are too big for a regular person to just lug around, like those of the Tau. Presently, the standard issue is the CMC 400, though a significant number of its predecessor, the CMC 300, can still be found in circulation. Like any good sci-fi armor, it weighs about a metric ton and helps us short kings by giving the wearer an extra 30 centimeters of height, or 1 foot for the feet-loving fish across the Atlantic. In terms of functions, the CMC 300 features full life support, advanced NBC, or nuclear, biological, and chemical protection, gravity accelerators, which allow for internal generation of gravity for use in zero-G environments, a plethora of sensory-enhancing or protective equipment, comms, a lockdown system used to stabilize wounded soldiers and or prevent a shorted-out suit from misfiring, though when activated it prevents the user from moving, increased structural support servos and pistons that allow dashing up steep slopes, making long jumps, and safely landing from a 6-meter, or 20-foot, drop, sidearm compartments in the lower legs, and a myriad other ones, all powered by cold fusion cartridges, who are noted to have less than a 0.5 failure rate in the field. Its arms are elongated, so the user's hands reach between the wrists and fingers of the suit, where they engage with the operator interface in the gauntlets. And despite the user's hand not fully slipping into that of the armor, an integrated haptic feedback system ensures more precise control, to the point where, like Astartes, small, fragile objects can be wielded. In comparison, the CMC 400 is essentially an upgrade on all of the CMC 300's features, with an expanded set to its communication systems, along with both external and internal durability enhancements. But Rat, I hear you say, what punishment can it withstand? And that will require some speculation. Defense-wise, we know it has shock absorbers, internal resin composite defenses, padding with crash webbing enveloping the user, and is covered by a type of non-flammable impact-resistant paint. But there is no direct mention in the lore about what exactly the armor is made out of. Except for one, relating to a variation of the suit called the CMC 400A, used by the United Earth Directorate, or UED. A separate Terran faction from Earth that attempted to reconquer the Caprulu sector into Earth's fold, but failed. Its plating is stated to be a blend of 80% depleted uranium and 20% titanium. So while not officially stated, as this is the only source of material we have available, and because the Terrans of the Caprulu sector adopted a lot of technology brought over by the UED invasion force, I will continue the video with the logical extrapolation that the general CMC 400 model is also majoritively made out of said materials, with maybe some minimal variation. In that regard, the CMC 400 is basically immune to small arms fire, including lasguns. Just from the metals used, thanks to their density and ability to disperse heat, the momentary impact of a las bolt would be able to flash melt a very thin amount of the surface layer, but no meaningful damage would be achieved. Continuous sustained hits, or ones from the higher output variations like las cannons, would break through, but given what your average guardsman will be going up against, it still won't be fair. However, I know that the real question was, how does it fare against bolters? 100% not a perfect solution, but any normal person would rather have this over the best carapace armor available to non-Astartes. Discounting shots to the visor or weak spots in the joints, thanks to its rounded design, there's a good chance of the bolts glancing off of it. Additionally, its composition would likely prevent 1 or 2 direct hits from penetrating instantly, but the follow-up explosions from them will very likely destabilize it enough for any follow-up shots to get through. I must preface, this is all referring to the standard bolt rounds. If we get into the more specialized ammunition, the results will not be that different from what happens to most other things when hit with them. If you're a Terran Marine that has to go up against Astartes, you better damn well make sure you're grabbing your 30mm bonded carbide combat shield in advance of the fight, and that might give you 2 or 3 more bolter rounds of survivability. Best case, however, would be the support of their combat medics, who utilize medical nanites and laser sutures that can practically partially patch you up on the spot in close proximity. That would make sustained engagements significantly more equal. As for what can, on its own, stand up to bolter fire, would be the CMC 660 Heavy Combat Suit. A heavily reinforced upgrade upon the CMC 300 chassis, bearing its same features, just with superior volume of plating, heat resistance, and other defense enhancements, as well as removing the visor headspace and replacing it with a fully enclosed helmet. When it comes to durability, these are what can equal Astartes' plate. At least from the front. Firebats are a bit notorious for their back-mounted flamethrower fuel tanks being uncomfortably explosive. For a more proper, all-around defense, one would significantly prefer the 5.4 armored infantry suit variant of the CMC 660, which is used by Marauders. But enough about defense. I know that what we all really care for is demolishing it. Same goes for the Terrans, whose mainline infantry tried and true is the C-14 Impaler Gauss rifle. You can argue that this baby is the main reason why the Marines' powered armor exists. Yes, there are variants of the weapon that can be used by regular people, but the proper, juicy version of this gun mimics your average bolter in quite a few ways. Most obviously, being too big, heavy, and its recoil being downright mutilating for normal people, hence it only being used while in powered armor. Ease of customizability, including add-ons such as scopes, an underbarrel grenade launcher, and, before any accusations of pussing out of melee like Tau come in, a 50cm, or 20-inch, aka conservative Catachan knife-sized, machete-like bayonet. I'm certain that at least several Imperial Guard fans felt a tingle below the belt at this. But wait, there is more. With a fire rate of 30 rounds per second, it also utilizes a plethora of ammunition variants, such as your classic hollow point, incendiary, steel-tipped, noted specifically for when you just want to maim rather than kill an enemy. Something I'm sure your standard guardsman or firecast warrior will greatly appreciate. And, most importantly, its preferred form of ammunition, which also gives it the Impaler name, and also extends the gun's effective range by 25%. The U-238 depleted uranium armor-piercing spikes. Hold up, they use it both for the armor plating and to make ammunition out of? How? Where are the Terrans getting this much depleted uranium from? I mean...
As you may know from your research, Captain, Coral was a hotbed of anti-Confederate sentiment for years. The Confederacy hoped to contain Coral's civil unrest by decimating it and its population with a massive nuclear barrage. Though the radiation levels on the planet are at an all-time low, its surface is now nothing more than a smoldering desert.
The catch, Admiral, is that because this world has already been devastated by nuclear fire, Minsk has no compunction against using nukes on us.
Nuclear launch detected. Nuclear launch detected. Nuclear launch detected.
I got a little present headed your way.
Tosh, we got a nuke ready for launch. Paint a target.
How'd I miss this button with a skull on it?
Launch detected.
Oh, baby. You're in for a world of pain.
Fire the damn warhead now! Put those monsters down and keep them down! I will turn this city into a radiated ruin if I have to. Another warhead!
I guess Space Australia is just pretty rich in uranium? Because they are very trigger happy with their nuclear devices, which implies plenty of material can be found across the Kaprulu sector. Regardless, when it comes to its use as ammunition, depleted uranium has a special little perk on top of its density, weight, and durability, which is also why it is used in the making of armor-piercing rounds in real life. It is self-sharpening. Not in the sense of shapeshifting like necrodermis or the like, but when impacting a surface, instead of concaving into a mushroom shape like most other materials, depleted uranium shears into a point, further assisting its penetrative power. And the power provided by the Impaler Gauss rifle, as some of you that are bigger nerds, and/or engineers, but I'd be repeating myself, have guessed from its name, is not limited to just the explosion of the gunpowder in the round. The velocity of the spikes it launches is further enhanced by built-in magnetic acceleration. Yep, you heard that right. This thing is a portable mini railgun. You know, those things the Tau have, that in lore are described as able to pierce through both sides of a tank, the speed of which creates a vacuum so powerful, it forces the tank to basically shit it screwed through the small exit hole of the munition. Those things that Space Marines hate, because they obliterate the gene seed when they hit? Suddenly this meme seems a tad more real. Obviously, since the C-14 is an infantry weapon and not a vehicle mount like in the case of the Tau railguns, its caliber is technically not enough to punch through something like Astartes' warplate in a single shot. However, consider the following. The CMC-400 suit of the Terran Marines has about 70% of the durability of Astartes' power armor. Heck, let's appease the more skeptic 40K fans and say 60%. Here's what the C-14, with its primary U-238 ammo, does to a CMC-400. That right there is exit shots. And if we could see the sorry sod misfortunate enough to be wearing that specific powered suit, his insides being mangled in a bloody mess from the vacuum would have greeted us. Calling back to the clarification that the true equivalent of Terran Marines in 40K is the Imperial Guard, it normally takes about 100 or so lasguns to put an Astartes down. With the firepower of the C-14, you'd probably need 2 or 3 to turn one of them Angels of Death into a plucked pigeon. and if it's turned against a target not wearing power armor, say goodbye to it and the 10 to 20 guys standing behind it. Though, if that sounds too Xenus-y for your liking, the Marauders, again, come to help, as their K-12 arm-mounted launchers spew forth armor-piercing Punisher grenades designed to break through hardened zerg carapaces, but are also able to tear up buildings and vehicles, both equivalent and in some cases superior to guard armor. Damn, these guys really are the Space Marines of StarCraft. Except with a few benefits that your average Astartes might even get envious of. For starters, the massive fuel tanks for the arm-mounted, essentially heavy flamers of the Firebats's CMC 660 are replaced with more defensive structure, as previously mentioned, but also with a miniature manufacturing plant, which is filled up with the necessary raw materials and automatically assembles the Punisher grenades on the spot, then loads them into the K-12s. With this surprisingly more efficient use of space, an individual Marauder basically has access to hundreds of munitions, increasing their effectiveness in prolonged engagements. The other being the fairly widespread variant of the Punisher grenades known as concussive shells. Upon detonating, these babies generate a temporary disruption to the gravity field surrounding a target, or, in certain models, a group of targets, powerful enough to affect things up to the size of a Lehman Russ tank. On this fun piece of tech that likely exists in 40k, but probably is far rarer to encounter, unless you're a Necron, Eldar, or an Orc at the peak of Mechboy summer. Since they are the main faction used for comparison, for obvious reasons, I'm going to do a hard pivot into the things in which the Terrans are just flat out better than the Imperium in. As a start, let's have a look at 3 vehicle types that are basically mirrors of each other. In one corner we have the Honorable Imperial Guard Sentinel, and in the other, its roided up interdimensional cousin, the Goliath Combat Walker. On average, the two come at about the same height, and the Sentinel has a wider variety of armaments, but in my opinion the Goliath's more min-maxed frame serves the purpose of a support vehicle to infantry much better. Yeah, it doesn't have attachments as punchy as a las cannon, or any melee options like the Sentinel Chainsword, but it doesn't need those to do its job, which is to fill the air with enough ordnance for enemy infantry, light vehicles, and aircraft to drastically reconsider being in the same area code as it. A task sublimely fulfilled by a fixed loadout of 2 to 3 autocannons and twin shoulder-mounted scatter missile racks, all of which are able to effectively track and fire down multiple targets independently from one another thanks to its powerful targeting array systems, turning it into an armored pillbox and an anti-air battery, with more reinforced plating than the average armored Sentinel, that can also run as fast as a car over any kind of terrain. Additionally, while the Sentinel cockpit features controls similar to those in Star Wars AT-STs, the mode of control of the Goliath is a more advanced version of the one used by the mechs in Avatar, where the pilot is strapped into a cradle that allows the machine to mimic its movements, some commands of which can also be vocally activated and acted upon by its onboard computing. This allows it to be more maneuverable and reactive, especially on the micro scale, for the purpose of dodging, taking cover, repositioning, and so on. And, as a treat, it is also equipped with gravity accelerators that allow it to operate in zero-gravity conditions, as well as special systems aiding in the mech getting up on its own in cases where it's been knocked down. Following up comes the ever-venerable Lehman Russ battle tank, facing off against its would-be rival, the Crucio siege tank. At a glance, they seem to basically be the same, both coming at about 60 tons. And if anything, the Lehman Russ might pull ahead due to having a greater arsenal variety and sporting both sponsons and additional hull-mounted armaments, while the Crucio only sports twin plasma cannons on its turret. Editor's note: yes, in-game the siege tank and some other units' weapons don't really look like what you'd expect their lore outfit to be, because, regrettably, Blizzard is very bad at correctly depicting the weapons from the lore. Resuming. So just with the twin plasma cannons on its turret, that makes it more equivalent to a Heresy-era Executioner Russ. However, due to its less archaic design, its hefty armor plating would be more effective at resisting punishment, and its tracks are less likely to be hindered by terrain. This is thanks to its multi-track configuration with 2 extra tracks for added stability, enhanced by a series of tubes in the chassis and the bogies of the tank, which pump a fast-drying gel onto damaged sections of the tracks, which replaces the lost tread segments upon hardening, extending its operational life beyond damage that would be crippling to other tracked vehicles. And the thick hydraulic outriggers, or legs, from its sides that can help push it out of binds. Oh, and this tiny little thing called Siege Mode, where the turret forgoes the 2 plasma cannons as it rearranges itself and transforms into the Crucio's Shock Cannon, a 180mm proper vehicle-mounted railgun, which fires superheated tungsten in a wide area or different shell variants, like armor piercing for example, turning the tank into an artillery piece. One that happened to be a pinch too destructive to friendly forces as well. That was until Lars Corp developed a smart shell capable of scanning for allied signatures and adjusting its detonation so that the friendly fire was minimized. A project that has had an astonishing 75% success rate. Variety is the spice of life, but I'd say this increased mobility and being able to switch between an executioner and a railgun basilisk takes the cake in this case. And in the final round, we'll go big, comparing the imposingly majestic god machines, the Titans, against the bringers of thunder and lightning, the Thors. However, to narrow it down, the Thors hit peaks of 30 to 33 meters in height, which puts them at the same size as Warlord Titans, the second biggest breed of Titan after the Imperator. Now, I know the exact size of Titans in the lore is contested, due to a bunch of conflicting sources, but the diagrams found in the rulebooks of the Titanicus game are the currently accepted official sizes, per which the parity of Warlords and Thors stands. If you don't like that, bring it up with GW, I'm just presenting the information. Anyway, back to big stompy mechs. Durability-wise, the hull of the Thor would not equal that of a Warlord, since it lacks adamantium. It still offers great protection, being made from a composite of neosteel and ceramics, designed to resist high-explosive armor-piercing rounds and powerful energy weapons. Additionally, its external armor is modular, making it very easy to maintain, replace, or enhance given the battlefield circumstances. And the machine itself is fairly recoverable, since if its hull remains intact, its built-in immortality protocol, developed by the arms manufacturer ATVX, allows the Thor to repair itself in the field back to functionality. When it comes to bringing down the thunder, it is no slouch either. For this, the choice of hammer comes in the form of 2 giant particle accelerator cannons on each arm for a total of 4, dealing destructive death well within the weight class of Warlord weaponry. Further aided by chest-mounted javelin fragmentation missile pods, where we're talking fragmentation meant to shred enemy aircraft, and a back-mounted set of either 250mm anti-aircraft cannons or 330 barrage cannons, or in short, shit that is liable to gun down void ships, as it is basically miniature ordinatus. For non-40k viewers, an ordinatus refers to a weapon too large to be borne by any kind of walker, sometimes including armaments normally mounted on void ships, who have a ground platform built exclusively for them. One of the most infamous examples of which is Oberon, a presumed Nova cannon adapted for planetary surface function, used in the book Hell's Reach to vaporize an orc gargant, which was almost bigger than and slew the Imperator Titan Storm Herald. The reason I call the Thor's back-mounted arrays miniature ordinatus isn't just because the walker can carry them, but because StarCraft ships are notably smaller than those of 40k, but we'll get to that later. Regardless, even with this well-earned glazing, in a one-on-one scenario, a Thor will near certainly lose to a Warlord Titan. Among its weapon profiles, the Emperor's God Machine can field horrors too lethal for the Thunder God to withstand, while its own hull is made of stronger materials, and the biggest difference maker, the Thor's lack of shields, whereas a Warlord bears its panoply of void shield generators. Plating alone would not be able to hold out long enough for the Terran mech to breach said shields and then punch through the Titan. Yet, I still think that what the Dominion engineers have produced is the superior of the Martians, based on 2 factors. Firstly, while Titans require an integrated pilot to just move, alongside additional crew to monitor and control the remaining systems and weapons, a Thor only requires a single pilot in order to bring its full capacity to bear. So the specialized personnel required to get one running, and which would be lost if one is destroyed, is far less crippling. Secondly, and in my opinion more importantly, the time it takes for a Thor walker to be manufactured is on par with the same time it takes to construct an Imperial Knight walker. Even if a Thor was just equal to 60% of a warlord, like with the Marine comparison, even though it's realistically closer to 80%, but whatever, being able to produce that in such a short span of time versus that of a full Titan of the same weight class, the former is still vastly more cost-effective. You can even apply this to the infantry, being able to train and equip the low-balled 60% of an Astartes in the same time frame the Imperium trains and equips one guardsman. Surely you've picked up on it by now. Efficiency and tactical flexibility, born from the fact that the Terrans are just better at adapting. Honestly, comparing the ability of research and development between them and the Imperium is like comparing that of the Skaven and the Dwarfs from fantasy. One is lightning fast, while the other is glacial. And this still stands even if you factor in that the Mechanicus predominantly relies on adopting newly rediscovered tech, rather than developing new ones due to their dogma. As a similar example, the medical nanites and laser sutures used by medics. Prior to the UED invasion of the Caprulu sector, that technology did not exist there, and neither did the combat medics clad in CMC armor. But within months of their arrival in the sector, the technology was reverse engineered and adapted for general army use by the Dominion. Then, in a mere 4 years, this revolutionary technology in the field of medicine was not only spread around all of the nations in the sector, but it was developed to the point where it could be used on ground troops in the middle of active combat, coming down from a dropship flying and or hovering overhead. It would take decades at minimum for the Mechanicus to work through their dogma and adapt something like that. Grav, communication, and terraforming technology are 3 other fields where the humans of StarCraft exceed those of 40K. Best exemplified with the following: dropships that usually fit up to 10 people in them, having the ability to transport Thors. Imagine a Thunderhawk carrying a Warlord Titan. An even better example, orbital drop pods that accelerate themselves for speedy deployment. Except, unlike those of Warhammer, these ones are capable of transporting regular people and vehicles like siege tanks, likely by creating an anti-gravity pocket within themselves in order to protect their payload from G-forces. That's phenomenal! Go ask Mordian Glory how it would feel to be able to deep strike a Russ on the board.
Is that a death strike in my trials or my place to see?
Meanwhile, when it comes to connection, they have engineered technology that lets them have near crystal clear video feed between 2 ships that are light years apart, on top of other means of communication. While, with the lattermost mentioned kind of tech, they kind of cheat. Instead of actually going through the tedium of terraforming like the Mechanicus do with their geo-engine megastructures that filter the air and change the climate, followed by the prolonged directing of habitation units tailored to the environment, the Terrans just find some planet that they want to explore, exploit, and or settle, and then, to quote Subsorian, just slap an atmosphere on it and call it a day. Literally, they have atmosphere generators that can create large radiuses of habitability based on their size and the amount of power put into them that work on planets with any kind of or no atmosphere at all, as seen in the book Firstborn, and they are fairly common devices found in use by all of the Caprulu nations. Again, innovation and efficiency, spawned by grueling necessity, curiosity, ingenuity, and the unstoppable might of the military-industrial complex, presented in the face of corporations that strive to follow the footsteps of Lockheed Martin, a couple of which we've already referenced. And the reason for this specific difference is very easy to realize when you overlap the timelines of the 2 settings. The Terrans are the humanity who grow to achieve the golden age of technology, while the Imperium maintains its authority with their hand-me-downs, and the best the Emperor could make before Horace had his bitch fit. In that light, when it comes to tech that is better in StarCraft than in 40K, we will unpin that note from the beginning and talk more about resocialization. Messing with the minds of others to the point where you gain control over them and can remake the person as you see fit. Even to the point where you can make someone kill a loved one without a second thought. The Imperium, or hell, most of the other factions, are no strangers to this, as they practice mind meddling in one form or another. Well, I'd argue that the Terrans are better at it than them, exception being the Necrons, because with just their technology, they manage to achieve something beyond what the subjects of the Golden Throne have, even when they use psychic means. Like the Tyranids, the Zerg of StarCraft operate as a hive mind, and when separated from it, devolve into mindless beasts. Here to the fore, I bring you the Cerberus Project. where Dominion scientists, who eventually split off into their own faction, managed to develop a way to control Zerg in an organized hive mind fashion, and essentially began to grow their own personal brood. To equal this feat, someone in 40k would need to tame a hive fleet tendril and grow it on his own terms. The closest anyone in the 41st millennium has come to this, to my knowledge, was a warband of Iron Warriors who injected a single Tyranid ship with the Obliterator virus, which broke the creature's mind, allowing them to steer it as a floating living factory that grew weapons and munitions for them. Actually, I just remembered, the StarCraft humans outdid themselves in this regard already, since the UED, again using just technology and drugs, managed to tame the newly growing Overmind, thus putting the majority of the Zerg swarm under their thumb. Following this, I'd like to bring up the story where the Tau captured an Astartes and tried to probe his mind, but he consciously forced his body to die, taking the scientists that were trying to breach his thoughts with him. From the examples we went over earlier in the video, I believe you, dear viewers, would concede that in the case of encountering each other, the Terrans would be far more adept at adopting 40k technology than vice versa. But with these last few ones, if they were to get their hands on a Space Marine, which, given that the bloody Tau did it, is very much so not unlikely, or nearly any other kind of valuable asset, they'd have the know-how with which to get him to reconsider his loyalties, so to say. With that tasty train of thought available to ponder, let us continue. Most of the ground pounders have had their time in the spotlight, but now it's time to look at the ones that move them from ground to ground, so they can get to pounding. The void ships. Yeah, being fully transparent here, there is no contest in a straight-up fight. The Terrans get trounced hard. Realistically, we only know about battle cruisers when it comes to vessels that aren't some form of supporting fighter craft. All of them are impressively armed, arrayed with twin laser cannons predominantly used for anti-air and ship-to-ship combat, and more electromagnetic coil guns for air-to-ground bombardment. And who can forget the Yamato cannon, which is the explosion of a tactical nuke. As in, just the explosion itself, harnessed through electromagnetic fields, which is then launched at enemy targets. Despite that, they look like absolute gnats compared to most 40k ships, as the smallest variants of the battlecruiser, like the Minotaur class, extend to a mere 500 meters in length, while the largest, the Gorgon class, reach 2 kilometers. Yes, Warhammer fans, you heard that right. The biggest Terran capital ship is the size of the smallest Imperial frigate escorts. Definitely not looking good for the StarCraft side. Of course, that is when it comes to a straight-up honest battle. But inventive little monkeys know that it is better to fight smarter rather than harder. Space guerrilla warfare. From that lens, smaller ships hold quite a few benefits. Cheaper, easier, and faster to build. At the most base level, losing a battle cruiser would be negligible compared to an Imperial cruiser or Emperor forbid battleship falling. An interesting factor is also that the void ships of most 40k factions can't really operate in the atmosphere of planets. Sure, they can dive in for brief periods, but their greater bulk puts them at a much larger risk of getting dragged down to the ground. While the Terran ships' lighter frames, combined with their superior anti-grav tech, enables even the biggest ships to be fully operational within a planet's skies. So even if they are not able to establish void supremacy, dislodging their air superiority would be extremely difficult. But void warfare is what matters most. In its context, smaller targets are more difficult to hit, doubly so when they are faster and more nimble thanks to their reduced size. And, as durable as Warhammer stuff is, having something with the strength of tactical nukes set off on them, especially near vulnerable spots like the engines, would still do awful damage after the void shields are broken through via concentrated fire. At which point, the smaller fleet would just flee, regroup, and do it all over again. I'd hazard a guess that quite a few of the 40k fans just had the thought that it wouldn't be that easy, or that it wouldn't work at all like that. If you did, well, feel free to bring that objection up with the verdict of 6 Primarchs. Across 3 books, we've seen 2 out of the 3 pillars of autism, the third-rate perfectionist, Mr. Stubborn McStubbornhands, the one that got decked into the floor by kitten autism, and Wonder Child Horace, before he was evil, all collectively face the issue of an enemy with smaller and more nimble ships bleeding their fleets to death via 1,000 cuts on several occasions, and agreed that they can't deal with it unless they corner said enemy refueling or find where their house is, in order to force said enemy into a straight-up fight. Which is how they finally overcame them. To the Imperium's particular detriment, however, in modern times their pool of Primarchs that can be thrown against the problem is diminished, and the Terrans in particular would be vastly harder to corner or stop from enacting vicious hit-and-run tactics, thanks to their biggest technological advancement over anyone in the 41st millennium: the main means of FTL travel in StarCraft, also called warp travel. While that might raise some eyebrows, it has nothing to do with what a normal 40k enjoyer associates with that word. In terms of function, it is more like slip space from Halo, a form of pocket physics-less dimension that allows you to circumvent time and space, which you access by having your ship's warp drive open a small wormhole for entry and exit. All with a relatively fixed distance to time ratio, where multiple light years can be covered in hours. Technically, that makes it slower than 40k's warp travel, since there is no time being fucky-wucky, with a chance of sending ships to their destination centuries before they even dive into the warp. But I would argue that it is much better because of two factors. First being consistency, a trait that blows randomness out of the water 5 out of 7 times every time. And the likely even better factor than not having to roll dice on whether you'll get to your destination early, on time, slightly late, centuries late, or at all, reliability. Displayed by, but not limited to, having the aforementioned set travel time that you can plan around without guesswork, being able to make both long and short warp jumps, not just for closing distance, but also possibly avoiding incoming projectiles, without risking the ship tearing itself apart or its navigators dying, like what nearly happened with the Echo of Damnation in the 3rd book of the Night Lord's Omnibus, as well as being able to make such jumps from any point in a solar system, rather than needing to be a decent distance away from gravity wells, up to and including within a planet's atmosphere for the somewhat higher quality warp drives. And best of all, the funky dimension being completely demon-free. When going through it, the crew's main worry would be over technical failure or accidentally exiting a warp jump right into a solid object or a star, instead of whether they will have to play host to some flavor of Space Satan's crotch fruit. In fact, by being completely unrelated to Warhammer's warp, the StarCraft means of FTL would not be affected and limited by its tumultuousness. All of which, along with not needing to be moored to anything like navigators, requiring only the equivalent of a big, non-sentient calculator to establish their course, in my opinion makes StarCraft warp travel a method of FTL for which the Emperor would probably smash his own Webway project without Magnus. Because, realistically, with it almost any faction would be able to make it for quite a while in the 40k galaxy on maneuverability alone. However, the natives of the Caprul sector have one extra similarity to their grim darker counterparts that will play an indispensable role in any kind of conflict between them: space magic. Here's where I expect the StarCraft fans to start reminding me that I seem to have missed something very important. Or should I say, scary important. And before you say it, no, I did not put off talking about it just because I main Protoss. Preamble aside, I am of course referring to the Terrans' very own super soldier, one that haunts the nightmares of their enemies and is sure to make a similar impact upon the Warhammer scene should he be brought there. The one and only
Ghost reporting. Boo.
Now, to put into perspective what bullshit these guys are, lend me your imagination for a moment. Breakfast non-perceivers need not apply. Imagine a Vindicare assassin who can go invisible, drinks from the same protein shakes that get mixed in the Eversource cocktails of nonsense, and, especially if cornered, have a non-zero chance of suddenly going,
"It's wizard time, motherfucker! Fireball!"
Since they don't need them as batteries, Terran Psychers instead get scooped up and put into Black Ops training, becoming secret agents and essentially superheroes to the masses, who don't know all the messed up shit they get put through on the path of becoming ghosts. Not all of them get to wear the fancy spandex though, since getting the actual killing machine regime is reserved only for those who display a psychic aptitude equal to Zeta level at minimum. For context on what a Zeta-level Psyker is, a great example are the two masked cultists from the Astartes animation, who fall somewhere between the Zeta and Gamma rating of the psychic scale, while the ones who fall under that threshold are instead used in more mundane positions, predominantly trackers of other Psykers, since they have an innate ability to detect others like themselves. Before we continue with the ghosts specifically, we need to go over what exactly their space magic is. Referred to as psionics, in terms of variety, these abilities, the most common of which are telepathy and telekinesis, more than match what can crop up in the 41st millennium. But they significantly differ when it comes to volatility, thanks to being tied innately to the biology of the psionics. Shit, both the abilities themselves and the people who have them are called psionics. Right. To avoid confusion, for the remainder of this video, psionics will refer to the settings equivalent to psykers, and I'll just call their powers psionic abilities. Back on track. But Rat, the more astute of you might object, what's so special about that? Being a psyker is also tied to your biology, since you need to be born as one. But that is where the key distinction lies. Psykers are born with the innate ability to tap into the warp and use it to manifest their powers, while psionics are born innately capable of theirs. There's no tertiary external component. Compared, the powers of psionics are more physical than spiritual, as they are tied to the realm of matter. Because of this isolation within the individual, they are significantly safer, since, at worst, the psionic fucking up real bad will cause themselves, and, very rarely, whoever is within some distance around them to scanners themselves. Most commonly, in a case of major failure, however, the psionic in question will just go mad and initiate a killing spree. Even with their enhancements and powers, that is nowhere near as major as getting possessed by a demon or ripping open a hole in reality for more demons to spew out from. But the psionics' best quality, which some of you may have gotten the thought for, is the fact that when introduced to the 40K galaxy, they would not be affected by the warp when using their abilities. Parallel to that is also the fact that the normal means of shutting down psykers, namely blanks, Blackstone, or the Tyranids' shadow in the warp, would also not work on them. Now, a Calexis assassin would still be able to obliterate their soul using their animus speculum, but they, or the Sisters of Silence's passive ability to nullify and not be affected by psychic powers, would not affect the abilities of a psionic, which would necessitate factions from Warhammer to use more psykers as countermeasures, and that, as we've already mentioned, has a lot more risks involved than one's grey matter popping like a balloon. Returning to the ghosts, other than the huge RNG of abilities they can have, they also get enhanced with special chemicals and materials, both physically and psionically, in order to boost their effectiveness as much as possible, which includes raising some of the operatives' psi rating, or psychic scale rating, via the gas known as terrazine, and then stabilizing their condition with psi-reactive jorium crystals, in the process of creating the most modern variant of ghosts, the Spectre. Gear-wise, they're equipped with a hostile environment suit, which is among the most advanced technology produced by Terrans, offering standard NBC protection and survivability in the vacuum of space, laced with psi-sensitive muscle fiber, which allows the ghost to channel their psionics through it, thus augmenting their strength, speed, and reflexes to the point where they can comfortably break through a wall, appear out of nowhere, disable multiple people faster than they can react to, crush a human skull, and promptly vanish. A disappearing act enabled by a personal cloaking device. The suit's outermost layer contains synthetic cells that, under psionic stimuli, refract light to synergize with the device and make the user invisible to the naked eye, while the suit's own temperature regulation system hides the user from heat vision and other forms of detection. Add to that their most standard armament, the C-10 rifle, which can't be used by normal people without the physical enhancements of the ghosts, and fires 25mm anti-personnel munitions that can penetrate through tank armor, or EMP munitions of various flavors to mess up machines. 40K's factions would need to up their investments in anti-stealth measures if these bastards were loosed in the galaxy. Good luck to any important person, unironically including Astartes, catching enough sleep if they know they are a thing. Given everything presented thus far, it's not difficult to conclude that if all of the Caprulu Terrans were placed within Warhammer 40K, they would not only survive, but, it could be argued, they just might thrive, easily achieving the same or better status as the Tau Empire, thanks to their stable FTL and means of rapid expansion. Though, in fairness, since the Severan Dominate is still kicking around, whilst holding off both Imperial attempts to pacify the region and an orc wah at the same time, the bar to achieve that may be deceptively low in the face of the 41st Millennium's perceived reputation. For those of you not familiar with them, the Severan Dominate are a group of systems that rebelled in secession from the Imperium, who only have their slightly modified but majoritively standard Imperial tech and equipment that they produce on their worlds, and constitute such an insignificant threat that the bovine fishweebs look intimidating by comparison. That's not to say that it would be an easy stroll through the park for them. A good chunk of their success would bank on everyone else being too busy to direct their full attention in their direction until they grow some more. What I'd put as the biggest concern for their survival, however, would, ironically enough, be chaos corruption. Specifically the slow, insidious kind that builds up in the shadows. Not having an overbearing dogma enforced societally helps with efficiency, yes, but that does leave an opening for the ruinous powers to slither their way inside. Then again, the Terrans have had to deal with something akin to it, where during the events of the End War in Legacy of the Void, a decent chunk of them had their minds directly taken over by what was kind of a chaos god. So if they can get an example of how chaos works, they may be able to come up with countermeasures, as long as said example doesn't result in too many of them falling under the great enemy's sway. Standing on their own is great and all, but there's also the obvious question, since they are human, would they join the Imperium? Obviously the easiest and frankly most boring angle to such a crossover would be for them to integrate with the big human faction, made extra easy due to having goody two-shoes Valerian in charge. Okay, no, I take that back. Valerian's actually a cool dude and an excellent leader. Aristocrat bred and trained for the position of ruler who actually genuinely cares about his people, to the point where he is willing to abdicate power for their sake, and even goes down to the battlefield together with his men in order to fend off literal cosmic horror spewing through the streets. We shouldn't be mean to Scooter. He's earned it. But in seriousness, personally I do not believe that any of the Terran factions would get subsumed by the Imperium. For starters, excluding their superior ability to defend their borders, in comparison to other similar factions, the Terrans are far too independence-minded. If something tries to impose upon them, they fight tooth and nail to tear themselves away from it. Seen in the Emojans maintaining isolation at high-tech gunpoint, resisting a bigger and more powerful faction from consuming you being simply Tuesday for the Kelmorian Combine, and overwhelming the previous system of power to come out on top for the Dominion. Regarding the Dominion more in particular, Valerian stood his ground against and talked down an Alpha Plus Psyker, who could, and I hate to admit it because I dislike her, fold Gilliman 12 times over. His will is verifiably strong enough to resist a Primarch's influence, similar to quite a few of the current High Lords, so he will not just submit if the two were to meet. So, at best, a close alliance would be on the table, but not integration. However, the biggest reason why such a merger would not happen is also the reason for the Terrans' success: their FTL and communication technology. Or, well, to be accurate, it is the ones who would pay keen attention to said technology. Like we previously went over, anyone in 40k would want to get their hands on it, to the point where I'm positive the Emperor would personally kill for the opportunity, so imagine what others would do. On the side of being interested in it, you have the Mechanicus, who would be appalled by the Terrans' use of AI, nothing actually sentient, just stuff comparable to the Tau's own AI, but also demand any and all rediscovered technology to be surrendered to their authority. Combine this with the Terrans' vehemence about independence, and the obvious factor that it is an incredibly stupid idea to just give up an advantage that gives you colossal strength in negotiations, and you get the picture of how this would cause too much strife for integration to occur. Opposite of that, however, you have the old interests, namely the Navis Nobilitae and the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. To illuminate the non-Warhammer crowd, the first of the two refers to the noble houses of the Navigators, a subspecies of humans that are psychers, possessing a third eye, who specialize in, as the name gives away, navigating ships through the tumultuous tides of the warp, e.g. Super Hell, while the latter is the organization dedicated to training the psychers not fed to the Emperor in order to maintain their lighthouse in the warp, turning them into either astropaths, who facilitate communication throughout the galaxy via psychic means, sanctioned combat psychers for the army, or any other kind of sanctioned psyker. In essence, both of them have a de facto monopoly on the mass-scale use of psychic powers, which has made them ludicrously wealthy, nigh untouchable politically, and like with a good chunk of people at the peak of money and power, pretty often insufferable to deal with. With the added pinch of unwilling tolerance, because they are, technically, mutants. Something the Greater Imperium does not like, but is forced to keep them around, because without their services, all Galactic Empire functions fall apart. But what if, suddenly, competition appeared? Something that can carry information reliably across light years without the risk of tearing open demon gateways, like the Scream perpetrated by the Night Lords of 10th Company. Something that allows for ships to travel safely and stably without even needing to get within sniffing distance of the warp. Something that demotes them to the status of redundant, unnecessary, and replaceable. Countless examples in our real-world history give a glaring answer to what structures of powers do in such cases. Destroy the opposition before it brings them down. And in this case, it will go doubly hard, because other than making additional combat psychers to deal with demon incursions, the remaining best use for the two organizations would be additional fuel for the Golden Throne, while decoupling their power from the reins of humanity. A fate that they would not allow to pass, by using every ounce of their influence in order to sabotage any kind of merger that would lead to it. And I assure you, their influence is vast, since during the Great Crusade, they likely lobbied the Emperor directly to outlaw the use of psychers by the Adeptus Astartes and the common military during the Council of Nicaea, which got Magnus shafted and assured their monopoly on the psychic fields. Now yes, the trial of the Thousand Sons as Primarch was predominantly launched on the accusations of his brothers Russ and Mortarion, but given the other rivalries that happened between the Emperor's sons, I do not find it compelling enough that their squabbling would have made him reach such a monumental decision. This is purely my speculation, hence why I say it is likely, but personally I am fully convinced that the Navigators and the Astra Telepathica, who are fundamental for the Imperium to exist at all, put their thumbs on the scale of this decision by the Master of Mankind, which he only acquiesced to because he was building the human webway, which would have also made the two of them replaceable, and he kept that knowledge from them. Now that I think about it though, you can also lump in the Mechanicus in this pile of I don't want to be replaced, since you can be sure Guilliman would much rather work with people that do science normally and more effectively than the dogma of Mars, which just adds another fundament of the Imperium's function to the Coalition. With such stupendously powerful interest allied against them, the Terrans are more likely to be lobbied for extermination than integration, possibly resulting in another civil war, except this one actually breaks the whole empire apart, due to being fought over its core fundaments of existing. And as much as I detest Papa Smurf, he isn't a retard. He would perceive all of that the nanosecond he learns of what these new humans can do. All of this is why I think the most likely outcome for the Terrans, if they are put in the 40K galaxy, is to become a close ally of the Imperium via direct proxy to Guilliman, while he tries to figure out a way to replace the inconvenient pillars of government before the Terrans expand to the point where they can possibly stand on business against him more solidly. Now, what I think the funniest possibility is, would be if Arcturus Mengsk is in charge of the Dominion when they get transported over. Oh, that piece of snake shit would make Mork happy with how cunning he is, and he just might worm his way on the Council of the High Lords of Terra via his machinations. Oh, he will definitely bite off more than he can chew at some point, but with his prodigiousness of being a slimy, backstabby, plans within plans twat that
knows where you'll walk before you do.
I'd bet money that he eventually ascends to become a Demon Prince of Tzeentch. Might keep that in the backlog of ideas as a narrative to potentially explore, if there is demand for it, but we'll see. Thank you all for your patience. I hope this video was to your satisfaction. If it did, please nuke the like button and let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, or predictions on how the other StarCraft factions would fare in the Warhammer 40K setting. To not miss out on future videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and in the case that you would like to support the channel a little extra, you can do so via the Ko-fi donation link from the description. With that, I hope you're having a great day, and wish you an even better one tomorrow. Do widzenia.